Some people think thieves wear masks. The worst ones carry clipboards. The sharp crack of a deadbolt echoed through the still morning air before I even reached the front porch. Pine needles crunched beneath my boots as the scent of fresh-cut cedar drifted across the shoreline, mixing with the cool breeze rolling off Blackwater Lake. My family's cabin stood exactly where it had stood for more than 40 years, tucked between towering white pines and a weathered wooden dock my father built with his own hands. But something felt wrong long before I saw the front door. A brand-new brass lock gleamed where my old one should have been. Blue painter's tape stretched across the windows. A temporary sign hung from the porch railing in neat black letters. HOA Community Recreation Property. I stopped walking. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle splash of water against the dock and the distant cry of a loon somewhere across the lake. Then laughter drifted out from inside my cabin. Real laughter. The kind that belongs at a family reunion, not inside someone else's home. I stepped onto the porch and looked through the front window. Folding tables had replaced my father's old rocking chairs. My grandfather's handmade fishing cabinet had been shoved into a corner to make room for a coffee station. Someone had covered our family photographs with framed HOA welcome signs. Standing in the middle of my living room was Linda Whitmore, president of the Lakewood Shores Homeowners Association, wearing an expensive cream-colored blazer and smiling as if she owned every inch of the place. She pointed toward the fireplace while directing two contractors where to hang a banner for an upcoming neighborhood lakeside social. She never looked toward the window. She never imagined I was standing 10 feet away watching every decision she made. My phone quietly recorded everything from inside the glass. I didn't knock. I didn't shout. I didn't pound on the door demanding answers. Instead, I noticed something far more important. The contractors had left the permit folder sitting wide open on my dining table. Linda signed a document, laughed with another board member, and slid it into the folder without reading the last page. The metallic click of my phone camera sounded almost silent compared to the pounding of my heartbeat. Years working as a civil engineer had taught me one lesson that mattered more than concrete or steel. People who believe they are untouchable always rush. They skip details. They leave trails. I backed away from the porch before anyone noticed me, breathing in the familiar scent of lake water that had followed me since childhood. This cabin wasn't just real estate. My father taught me to cast my first fishing line from that dock. My mother painted sunsets from the back deck every fall. Every board carried fingerprints from someone I loved. Linda thought she had taken a building. She had actually walked into decades of documented ownership, carefully preserved records, and one mistake so large it would soon reach an office far beyond our little lakeside neighborhood. 5 days later, the same woman smiling inside my cabin would watch state investigators place evidence boxes into government vehicles while the doors of the HOA office were sealed behind them. 18 years earlier, my father handed me a small brass key while we stood at the end of the dock watching the sun disappear behind the tree line. He closed my hand around it and smiled the way only a man who trusted hard work more than luck could smile. He said that land was never really owned by the person with the loudest voice. It belonged to the person willing to care for it year after year. I have carried that key ever since. My name is Ethan Walker. I am 41 years old, and I work as a civil engineer designing bridges, retaining walls, and flood control systems across the Midwest. My career taught me to respect facts, measurements, and paperwork because concrete never cares about opinions. It only responds to what is true. The same is true for property lines. This cabin sat on just under 12 acres along the northern shoreline of Blackwater Lake, more than 300 feet outside the official boundary of the Lakewood Shores Homeowners Association. My grandfather purchased the land in 1982 when nobody wanted rocky lakefront covered with pine trees. Every summer afterward became another layer of family history. We replaced roof shingles together after storms. We rebuilt the dock twice. We planted maple trees that now stretched high enough to shade the entire shoreline during late afternoon. Every improvement had permits, receipts, inspection records, and photographs carefully stored inside a weatherproof filing cabinet hidden beneath a workbench in the utility room. My father believed memories deserved documentation almost as much as deeds. After he passed away, I inherited the cabin exactly as he intended, untouched by debt and protected by a trust that had been reviewed more times than I could count. I never cared about luxury. The old rocking chair overlooking the water mattered more to me than any lakefront mansion. Every October, I drove 4 hours from my home just to spend one quiet weekend listening to wind move through the pines and watching fog drift across the water before sunrise. The cabin reminded me who I was before deadlines, conference calls, and construction schedules filled my calendar. Then Lakewood Shores began expanding. New vacation homes appeared one after another. Expensive boats replaced old fishing skiffs. Real estate signs multiplied along every road leading to the lake. Property values climbed higher each year, and with them came people who saw shorelines as investments instead of places where families built traditions. Linda Whitmore became the face of that change. She sold luxury homes, chaired neighborhood meetings, and spoke constantly about protecting community standards. Every conversation somehow ended with increasing property values. During my first meeting with her 2 years earlier, she glanced toward my cabin across the water and casually suggested that the area would make a beautiful private clubhouse one day. I laughed because I thought she was joking. She did not laugh back. Her eyes stayed fixed on my shoreline with the same expression developers wear when studying an empty lot. Looking back, that was the first warning I completely misunderstood. I believed good fences, accurate surveys, and recorded deeds were enough to protect honest ownership. I had no idea someone had already begun treating my family's cabin as the final piece in a much larger plan. The following spring, the atmosphere around Blackwater Lake changed in ways that had nothing to do with the seasons. The familiar scent of pines slowly gave way to fresh landscaping mulch, newly poured concrete, and expensive outdoor fireplaces appearing behind newly built vacation homes. Every month, another luxury property seemed to rise along the shoreline, and every month Linda Whitmore somehow appeared in another glossy real estate advertisement promising exclusive lakeside living. She spoke about preserving the character of the community, but every improvement somehow came with another expansion proposal from the Homeowners Association. One afternoon, she stopped by while I was replacing a few weathered dock boards. The rhythmic tap of my hammer echoed across the calm water as she stepped onto the gravel path, wearing perfectly clean white shoes that somehow never collected dust. She complimented the view before casually asking whether I had ever considered selling the cabin. I smiled and told her it had been in my family for decades and would stay that way. Her smile never disappeared, but something behind her eyes changed. It became colder, more calculated, like someone mentally crossing one option off a checklist before moving to the next. From that day forward, the letters started arriving with surprising regularity. The first one claimed my dock did not meet newly adopted community appearance standards. The second insisted that my firewood stack was visible from neighboring properties. The third suggested that my canoe storage affected the scenic value of nearby homes. Every envelope carried the official Homeowners Association logo, even though my property had never been included within its legal jurisdiction. At first, I assumed it was an administrative mistake. I politely responded with copies of my survey and county records showing the cabin sat completely outside the association boundary. Weeks later, another letter arrived repeating the same demands as though my response had never existed. Then small inconveniences began appearing around the property. Temporary directional signs suddenly pointed visitors toward my private driveway during busy weekends. Bright orange survey flags appeared near my shoreline without explanation before quietly disappearing a few days later. Someone installed decorative community markers suspiciously close to my entrance road. None of these actions caused serious damage, but together they created the impression that my land had somehow become connected to Lakewood Shores. Neighbors started asking whether I had finally joined the association. Even delivery drivers occasionally mentioned seeing community maps that showed my shoreline shaded the same color as every Homeowners Association lot. That was when I realized this was never about mailbox colors or dock boards. Linda was slowly rewriting the story people believed about my property. If enough residents accepted that the cabin belonged inside the neighborhood, challenging that assumption later would become much harder. I watched her present colorful development sketches during public meetings showing walking trails, picnic areas, and a future lakeside recreation center. Every illustration conveniently included the exact spot where my family's cabin stood, except the cabin itself had quietly disappeared from every drawing. She never mentioned my name. She never directly claimed ownership. She simply acted as though my property had already become part of her vision. Standing in the back of those meetings, I could almost hear my father's voice reminding me that the loudest plans often collapse under the weight of overlooked facts. I just did not realize how soon Linda would stop pretending and decide to act as if those facts no longer mattered. The next Friday afternoon, I drove back to the cabin expecting another certified letter taped to the porch. Instead, I found 3 unfamiliar pickup trucks parked beside the gravel drive and a pair of temporary banners fluttering in the breeze that read, Lakewood Shores Member Appreciation Weekend. The smell of charcoal drifted through the trees long before I reached the front steps. Folding chairs lined the shoreline where my family used to gather for quiet evenings, and coolers sat beneath the old maple tree my grandfather planted over 30 years earlier. Someone had even tied blue ribbons around the dock posts as though they were decorating property that had always belonged to them. I stayed out of sight behind a stand of pine trees and watched the scene unfold. Linda moved through the crowd greeting residents with effortless confidence, pointing toward the water as if she were giving a tour of a resort she personally owned. Every few minutes, she repeated the same sentence. Our association is finally bringing this beautiful shoreline back to the community. Nobody questioned her because she spoke with absolute certainty. Confidence has a strange way of sounding like truth when people never stop to verify the facts. A local catering company unloaded tables onto my back deck, while another contractor installed decorative signs near the front entrance. One worker carried a cordless drill. Another replaced the weathered lock on my cabin door with a polished brass deadbolt that reflected the afternoon sunlight. The sharp metallic click echoed across the quiet lake, sounding strangely final. Linda accepted the new key, slipped it into her purse, and thanked the contractor as though she had every legal right to do so. My stomach tightened, but I never stepped forward. Instead, I quietly opened the camera application on my phone and zoomed in. Every license plate, every company logo, every receipt left on the folding table, every signature exchange between Linda and the vendors. They documented everything for me without realizing it. Then something unexpected happened. One contractor carried a thick permit folder into the cabin and left it open while organizing paperwork on my dining table. A breeze drifting through the open window flipped several pages, exposing maps, invoices, and a checklist with handwritten notes beside completed tasks. Linda leaned over, signed another page, and laughed with a board member about how wonderful the place would look after a few cosmetic updates. She never noticed the small security camera tucked beneath the old wooden shelf above the stone fireplace. Years earlier, my father installed it after a winter storm damaged the roof, wanting a simple way to monitor the cabin whenever nobody was there. I upgraded the system after inheriting the property, adding cloud storage that quietly recorded every movement whether anyone remembered the camera existed or not. While everyone enjoyed refreshments on the deck, the tiny lens continued capturing faces, conversations, timestamps, and every decision made inside those walls. As evening settled over Blackwater Lake, golden sunlight reflected across the water exactly the way I remembered from childhood. Everything outside looked peaceful, yet I knew something had quietly changed forever. Linda believed she had taken control because she possessed a new key. What she failed to understand was that every minute she spent inside my family's cabin created another permanent piece of evidence that no replacement lock could ever keep hidden. The hardest part was not fighting back. It was pretending I had already lost. The following Monday, I drove past the cabin just after sunrise and kept going without stopping. The golden light reflected across Blackwater Lake exactly as it always had, and the smell of damp pine filled the truck through the open window. Every instinct told me to march onto the property and demand my key back, but emotion has ruined more legal cases than bad evidence ever has. Instead, I spent the morning sitting in my engineering office surrounded by blueprints while my laptop quietly synchronized every video clip from the hidden camera to an encrypted cloud folder. Hour after hour, the files continued arriving. Linda hosted planning meetings inside my living room. Board members carried boxes labeled Lakewood Shores Recreation Committee into the cabin. Contractors measured walls, discussed renovation ideas, and compared invoices. One volunteer even commented that it was fortunate the previous owner had finally moved on because the building was too valuable to remain private. Nobody corrected him. Nobody questioned why there was no purchase agreement, no closing documents, and no recorded transfer. They simply accepted the version of reality Linda had created. That afternoon, I drove to the county recorder's office. Instead of returning to the lake, the cool air inside the archive smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. I requested certified copies of every deed, survey, easement, tax payment, and boundary map connected to my property dating back to my grandfather's original purchase. The clerk recognized the parcel number before I even finished speaking. She smiled and said my family's records were among the most complete files in the county because every transfer, inspection, and shoreline improvement had been documented with unusual care. I quietly thanked my father all over again. Back at home, I spread everything across my dining room table. The brass key rested beside stacks of documents while my computer displayed timestamps from the security footage. Every photograph, receipt, permit, invoice, and tax statement fit together with the precision of a structural drawing. Then another unexpected piece fell into place. The electronic lock that Linda had installed automatically generated access logs through the manufacturer's mobile application. The contractor had registered the system using the homeowners association email address, meaning every door opening and closing created another digital record connected directly to the organization. They had unknowingly built their own timeline. Meanwhile, Linda became bolder with every passing day. New social media photographs appeared showing neighborhood events on my dock. Community newsletters announced future gatherings at what they now called the Lake House. A fundraising campaign even encouraged residents to donate toward improving the facility for everyone to enjoy. The comments below the posts were filled with congratulations, smiling faces, and excited plans for summer activities. Reading them was strangely calming because each public post quietly preserved another admission that the homeowners association had exercised control over property it never legally possessed. Friends kept asking why I was staying so quiet. The answer was simple. I was no longer trying to convince Linda she was wrong. I was allowing her to convince everyone else that every decision had been hers. The louder she celebrated, the clearer the evidence became. And somewhere beneath the growing stack of documents on my table, I could almost feel the first pieces of a much larger picture beginning to lock perfectly into place. 3 nights later, I found the detail that changed everything. It was almost midnight when I replayed one of the security recordings for what had to be the 20th time. Rain tapped softly against my office window while the glow from 2 computer monitors filled the room with pale blue light. Most people searching for evidence watch the obvious parts. They focus on faces, conversations, or dramatic moments. Engineers watch patterns. I noticed Linda carrying the same blue binder into every meeting inside my cabin. She always opened it to the same section before asking board members to sign documents. On one recording, the pages briefly faced the hidden camera for less than 2 seconds before she turned them away again. I froze the frame, enlarged the image, and slowly adjusted the contrast. The document title became readable. It was labeled Lakewood Shores Community Recreation Property Transfer Resolution. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Calm usually means your brain has found something important before your emotions have. The following morning, I visited the county administration building once again. The familiar scent of paper, printer toner, and old hardwood greeted me as I requested every public filing connected to that resolution. The clerk searched for nearly 15 minutes before looking back at me with a puzzled expression. There was no filing, no application, no recorded transfer, no boundary amendment. Legally speaking, the document I had seen on camera did not exist anywhere outside Linda's binder. That discovery opened an entirely different door. I submitted a public records request for recent homeowners association meeting minutes, annual financial reports, and architectural committee approvals that had been distributed to residents. Within days, a digital archive landed in my email inbox. As I compared those files with the security footage, small inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. Dates did not match. Attendance records listed people who had not appeared in the videos. Expense reports referenced improvements to a recreation building that was still legally my family's private cabin. Vendor invoices described community renovation work performed at an address that county tax records continued listing under my name alone. Every document seemed ordinary by itself, but together they painted a picture that became impossible to ignore. Then another coincidence arrived at exactly the right moment. A landscaping company accidentally mailed me a duplicate invoice because my cabin address remained attached to the parcel in the county database. The bill requested payment from the Homeowners Association for shoreline improvements completed on my property. Attached was a signed approval bearing Linda's signature and a budget code identifying the expense as an official association project. She had unknowingly created a direct financial record connecting organizational funds to private property outside the association's authority. By then, my dining room table had disappeared beneath carefully organized folders, printed screenshots, certified records, photographs, invoices, and access logs. Colored tabs marked every date, while handwritten notes connected each piece like lines across an engineering blueprint. The cabin itself was no longer the biggest issue. What I was looking at reached beyond one shoreline or one neighborhood dispute. It suggested a pattern of decisions, financial approvals, and official representations that deserved far more attention than a local disagreement could ever receive. I leaned back in my chair, looked at the old brass key resting beside my father's weathered compass, and quietly realized that the next phone call I made would not be to the Homeowners Association, a local police officer, or even a private attorney. The evidence had already grown into something much larger than any of them could resolve. The phone call lasted less than 9 minutes, yet it took me nearly a week to prepare for it. Every folder on my dining room table had been organized 3 different ways, first by date, then by subject, and finally by the order in which each piece of evidence supported the next. The old brass key remained beside my laptop, not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me why none of this was about winning an argument. It was about protecting something my family had spent 4 decades building honestly. Early Tuesday morning, I scanned every certified record, every tax document, every survey, every invoice, every access log, and every screenshot from the hidden security camera into a single encrypted file. The upload took almost 40 minutes over my rural internet connection, while the smell of fresh coffee filled the quiet kitchen. Outside, sunlight reflected across Blackwater Lake as though nothing unusual had happened. Boats drifted peacefully across the water while neighbors waved to one another, completely unaware that hundreds of pages of evidence were quietly leaving my computer. When the upload finished, I placed one final document into the file. It was my grandfather's original deed from 1982, complete with the county recording stamp that had survived every legal transfer since then. That single page connected every other document in the package like the cornerstone beneath a bridge. I submitted everything through the official reporting process and attached a detailed timeline explaining each event exactly as it occurred without exaggeration, speculation, or personal attacks. Facts are persuasive enough when they are complete. Later that afternoon, my telephone rang. The caller introduced herself as an investigator assigned to review the submission. Her questions were calm, direct, and surprisingly detailed. She asked about property boundaries, recorded ownership, public filings, financial documents, and whether I had preserved the original electronic files instead of edited copies. I answered each question exactly as my records showed. Before ending the conversation, she thanked me for organizing the materials so thoroughly because, in her words, clear documentation often determines how quickly a review can move forward. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. Then I waited. I did not contact Linda. I did not comment on social media. I did not attend homeowners association meetings. I simply continued living my normal routine while quietly monitoring the security camera. Ironically, my silence seemed to encourage even more activity. Linda announced a grand reopening celebration for what she proudly called the community lake house. New outdoor furniture arrived. Decorative lighting appeared around the deck. Fresh landscaping bordered the entrance path. Volunteers painted signs welcoming residents to upcoming summer events. Every improvement generated new receipts, new photographs, new newsletters, and new public announcements that continued expanding the timeline already sitting inside the investigator's file. Watching those recordings became strangely surreal. Linda walked through each room greeting guests with complete confidence, never imagining that every speech, every signature, every announcement, and every organized event strengthened the very evidence she believed no one would ever question. One evening, I stood across the lake as the cabin lights reflected across the still water, listening to laughter drift through the pine trees. I felt no anger anymore. Only patience. Bridges fail when too much weight is placed on a foundation that was never designed to support it. Linda believed she had built something permanent. She had actually constructed an entire story on top of documents that could not withstand careful examination, and somewhere beyond our quiet lakeside community, that examination had already begun. Saturday arrived with clear skies and the kind of perfect weather that always drew crowds to Blackwater Lake. The scent of grilled food floated across the shoreline, while music drifted through the pine trees from speakers someone had placed on my back deck. From a small public overlook across the water, I watched families carrying folding chairs toward the cabin, smiling as volunteers welcomed them to what they believed was a new community gathering place. Linda stood near the entrance greeting everyone with effortless confidence, wearing the same cream-colored blazer I had seen weeks earlier. A photographer snapped pictures as she shook hands and pointed proudly toward the dock where my father had once taught me to fish. She looked completely relaxed, unaware that every cheerful photograph was capturing the final moments of a story she had carefully constructed. Just after 10 o'clock, 3 unmarked government vehicles turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin. They were not flashy, and they did not arrive with lights or sirens. They simply rolled forward at a steady pace before stopping near the entrance. Conversations gradually faded. Music continued playing for another few seconds until someone quietly turned it off. Several professionally dressed investigators stepped out carrying document cases instead of toolboxes. One of them approached Linda with a calm expression and introduced herself. Even from across the water, I could see Linda smile politely at first, assuming they had come to enjoy the event. That smile slowly disappeared as official identification was presented and a folder was opened. Another investigator spoke with the contractors who were still completing decorative work around the property, while a third began photographing signs, furniture, and the entrance. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody rushed. The entire scene unfolded with remarkable professionalism, almost quietly, which somehow made it even more powerful. Guests stepped aside as investigators requested access to meeting records, vendor agreements, financial documentation, and electronic devices associated with the project. Volunteers looked at one another with confused expressions. Several board members began searching through boxes inside the cabin, pulling out binders they suddenly seemed much less eager to display. One investigator compared printed documents with photographs already contained inside a thick evidence folder. Another carefully reviewed the permit binder that had spent weeks sitting openly on my dining table during meetings. Every page seemed to answer another question before anyone even asked it. Then I noticed something that made me quietly smile. A contractor unlocked the electronic deadbolt using the Homeowners Association mobile application exactly as he had done every day since installing it. The investigator immediately requested the associated access records. The same digital timeline I had discovered weeks earlier now connected every organized event, every meeting, and every recorded entry into the cabin. Technology had preserved what memory never could. Before noon, labeled evidence boxes were being carried from the Homeowners Association office nearby and placed into the government vehicles. Residents stood silently along the shoreline watching a situation they clearly had never expected. Some appeared shocked. Others looked disappointed. A few quietly walked away without saying anything at all. Linda remained near the porch speaking with investigators, her confident posture gradually giving way to the realization that the discussion had moved far beyond neighborhood disagreements. I stayed exactly where I was, listening to gentle waves brush against the dock while sunlight reflected across the lake. Weeks earlier, she believed replacing one lock had given her control. In reality, every choice she made after turning that key had simply added another page to the file that was now resting inside those government vehicles. A week later, the cabin was quiet again. The temporary banners were gone. The folding tables had disappeared. Fresh morning dew covered the dock, while the familiar scent of pine and lake water drifted through the open windows exactly the way it had when I was a child. The replacement lock had been removed during the property restoration process, and for the first time in weeks, I slid my father's old brass key into the original deadbolt. The soft metallic click echoed through the empty cabin, sounding less like a door opening and more like a chapter finally closing. Inside, my grandfather's fishing cabinet stood back where it belonged beside the stone fireplace. The old rocking chairs overlooked the water once again, and family photographs returned to the walls where generations of memories had always lived. I spent the afternoon putting everything back exactly the way my parents had left it. Some people believe victory arrives with loud celebrations. Mine arrived with silence, sunlight reflecting across calm water, and the comforting creak of weathered wooden floorboards beneath my boots. During the following weeks, neighbors began stopping by one at a time. Some apologized for believing the stories they had been told. Others admitted they never questioned whether the cabin actually belonged to the association because they assumed someone in authority must have verified the facts. I never blamed them. Most decent people expect honesty from those elected to represent a community. That expectation is exactly what makes misplaced trust so dangerous. The conversations gradually shifted from my cabin to something much larger. Residents started requesting copies of meeting minutes, asking more questions about budgets, attending board meetings, and reading documents before signing them. For the first time in years, people seemed more interested in facts than rumors. The lake itself had not changed, but the community around it had. One evening, I carried my father's weathered tackle box onto the dock and watched the sunset paint the water with streaks of gold and deep orange. The brass key rested beside me on the old cedar bench where he used to drink coffee before sunrise. I realized that every small detail had mattered. The hidden camera, the forgotten permit folder, the electronic lock, the misplaced invoice, the public records, even the quiet decision not to argue when emotions were running high. None of those moments seemed important by themselves. Together, they formed a bridge from uncertainty to truth, one careful step at a time. Looking back, I understand that Linda never truly lost because someone outsmarted her in a dramatic confrontation. She lost because she underestimated patience. She believed confidence could replace documentation, that assumptions could outweigh recorded facts, and that enough repetition could eventually rewrite ownership. She was wrong on every count. The cabin still stands on the same shoreline where my grandfather first imagined building it more than 40 years ago. The maple trees continue growing. The dock still greets the first light of every morning. The brass key remains in my pocket whenever I visit, not because I fear someone else will claim this place again, but because it reminds me that some legacies are protected one quiet decision at a time. Justice rarely announces its arrival. It does not need applause, raised voices, or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives in a neatly organized file, a carefully documented timeline, and the simple truth that has been waiting patiently all along.